So I had a wonderful, captivating beginning to the sermon that was going to draw you all in. And at Farmer's Market, Dave messed it up and said, the first thing I want to hear is, why is Ruth in the Bible? So why is the book of Ruth in the Bible? I mean, if you've read it ahead of time, like I had asked you to, you know the story. It's a short story that tells us about God working behind the scenes. The providential hand of God, God's hand in the glove of human life, if you will. And as it was being told in the time of Judges, Israel needed an encouraging story. That, my friends, is why I think Ruth was put in the Bible. It was written because the Israelites needed a reminder that God really is in control, even though he has allowed humanity to do what was right in our own eyes. And so that's Dave's answer, even though he's roaming around somewhere in the narthex. You can tell him afterwards. So now let's start with take two. I want to tell you, oh no, he's not, he's over here. You're in the wrong side of the pew. What happened? Okay, and I'm proud of you for it. So now let's start over again. I want to tell you a story about a young man. The story begins back in 1993. And this young man was honoring God, living faithfully according to God's commands, and was single. God had better plans for my life. I mean, his life. There also, as it happened, was a young woman who was living in a city called Johnson City, Tennessee. She was pursuing a master's degree in community and agency counseling. That, of course, is Carolyn. I was living in Bristol at the time, so it's a total distance of 21 miles from Bristol to Johnson City. Now, what you don't know of the backstory is Carolyn and I knew each other and became great friends in college when for a period of a little over 6 months, I dated her best friend, Kathy. Yeah, you can laugh now because you know the rest of the story, but when Kathy and I broke up for reasons that we don't need to go into, particularly in public and that are on the internet, suffice it to say, Carolyn went with her friend, Kathy, and they went their way and I went mine. And so we didn't see each other for several years. I had graduated a couple years ahead of them, went off to seminary, graduated, was working. And God decided that Carolyn and I needed to reconnect. Here's how it happened. You might want to get out your road map to start counting the miles. Mark, my friend in Richmond, Virginia, where I had been in school, he was working in the church I had served my internship in, came down from Bristol so together we could go to a youth conference in Atlanta. While at the youth conference in Atlanta, we left the convention center to go to Underground to go to dinner. While we were having dinner in Underground, Kim from Florida had come up to go to the same conference, had left the same conference to go to dinner at the same restaurant in Underground. She came running across the restaurant. Russ, Russ, Russ. Mark looked at me and said, I sure hope you know her. So Kim and I had gone to college together. Kim is the reason I passed Greek too, because she understood participles. I still don't. But Kim was married to Tony. Tony and Carolyn were study partners in the science side of Presbyterian College. So from this restaurant in Underground Atlanta, Kim leaves the conference early to go back home to Florida to get Tony to drive to South Carolina to go to PC's homecoming. Carolyn left Tennessee to go to South Carolina to PC's homecoming. I stayed in Atlanta at the conference. At the homecoming, Carolyn and Tony were connecting when Tony's wife, Kim, said, guess who I ran into? Russ Weekley. Guess where he is? In Bristol. So from Virginia to Tennessee to Atlanta, from Florida to Atlanta to South Carolina, and Tennessee to South Carolina, and South Carolina back. to connect two people that were 21 miles apart. I got a phone call from Carolyn shortly after that. I was relatively new in the position there. I get a phone call from a young woman's voice. She said, "Hi, you don't know who this is, do you?" I had no clue. The first thought that ran through my head was, oh great, this is one of the kids in the youth group. Not only do they expect me to know them, but they expect me to know them by voice. Oh, it's not for me, it's okay. And so I said, no, I don't know who this is. And she said, it's Carolyn. And my brain is racking through every kid in the youth group going, oh great, not only did I not know her by voice, I don't know a Carolyn in the youth group. It's because there wasn't one. Long story short, we got together, went to Ruby Tuesdays that night, had a glass of tea, and actually closed the place down just catching up. Couldn't date her. A friend from Richmond came back down later. I don't remember how many months later. It was February 10th, coldest day of the year, because that was the day I moved. But he said, Russ, I don't mean to be rude, but why in the bleep, expletive deleted, aren't you dating that girl? I said, Mark, I can't date her. She's my best friend. And he just looked at me like, you'll get it eventually. Well, almost a quarter of a century later, you know the story. She and I have been wonderfully, happily married with 3 lovely kids, 2 dogs, and a cat. That's God's hand at work. I want to tell you another story, this one not quite so long or involved, but many years ago, my father passed away. My mom, living by herself, going through the mail, and as many of you who have experienced the loss of a loved one know, sometimes mail for the deceased continues to come to the house. Mom's habit was to simply throw that mail away. But this one particular letter had a real stamp on it. It wasn't machine posted, it was hand addressed with a real stamp, so she opened it. And it was a letter from my dad's high school class reunion committee inviting him to the reunion. Well, she called that particular committee member. His name was John Shimoleski, and she said, John, I just want to let you know, Ron passed away this year, so he won't be making it to the reunion. And that struck up a correspondence. Email correspondence at first, and then phone calls. Phone calls eventually turned into visits. Visits turned into wedding bells. And now here we are, over a decade after that letter was sent, and Mom is now Mrs. Shimoleski. God's hand at work through a postage stamp. The reason the book of Ruth is so powerful for us today is because it shows us how God's hand is at work, even in the midst of our deepest sorrows or our hardest struggles. Naomi and Ruth had come back with nothing. Chapter 2 essentially opens on day 2 of their return. Interestingly enough, it ends 7 weeks into their return. That's how stories go. But that morning, Ruth says, Naomi, I'm going to go gleaning. It was the equivalent, it was the social safety net. It's not the equivalent of welfare, but it was the social safety net that God's law had put into place. Gleaning is the process, if you owned the field, you weren't allowed to harvest all the way to the edges. You were to leave the corners. We find it a couple of different places in Leviticus as to what this practice was supposed to look like, but it was intended that those crops be left for the widows, the orphans, the foreigners, and the poor. Well, Naomi's got 3 out of 4 right there. Ruth, rather, has 3 out of 4. Naomi's got 2. In that process, and I love the way the author tells the story, as it so happens, she ends up in the field of Boaz. She doesn't know who the field owner is. We have to recognize that there's an inherent risk in her activities. Yes, it's the safety net that's set up by God's law, but humans are the ones enacting it. And we find both from Boaz's remarks and from Naomi's reply when Ruth comes home, this was a potentially very dangerous activity for Ruth. As a single woman, she had no man to protect her. As a foreigner, she had no status, even within the community. And yet, so she goes to the overseer and says, "May I glean in this field?" The answer is yes. And so she gets to work. I want you to understand just exactly what this work looked like. Harvesting barley. Can you get a mental image in your head of what a stalk of barley looks like? It's a kind of tall grass, has little seeds that are actually the grains at the top of the head. Probably averaging 15 to 20 grains per stalk at that time, depending on what the soil conditions were and what the water and nutrients and everything. And throughout the day, she gathers 30 pounds of barley. Now, I can't give you the exact measurement because I don't have my notes with me, but imagine roughly a 5-gallon bucket full of little seeds picked one stalk at a time. Some of it was indeed picked in a harvesting fashion. You walk up, you grab it, or you cut it. A lot of it was picked up behind the reapers. Bend over, pick it up, do it again. Bend over, pick it up, do it again. This isn't a free ride. This is hard work. It's just land she hadn't planted. Now, there are three main characters in our story today, of course. We have Boaz, who is the landowner, and we're going to talk about how for him, everything begins with his relationship with God. As someone who followed the law, he left the corners and edges of his field so those who wanted to glean could. But we also see in his character that he's a man of God. As he comes to the field, he greets his workers not with a whip and demands for higher productivity, but with a blessing. They respond in kind. So we recognize as a boss, he's apparently a pretty nice guy. Throughout the day, he's there with the workers, but he comes up to his supervisor and says, "Whose woman is that? Who does she belong to?" Here in Gwinnett, we've lost a little bit of small town understanding, but if we think back to small town living, where if you walk out the door that morning and you forget what you were going to do that day, it's okay because your neighbor can tell you. He looks out in his field and there's somebody different. Who's that? What's her story? If we listen to the overseer's words, we hear how much of an outcast and potential distance there was. Oh, that's the Moabitess, Ruth. She's a foreigner. She asked if she could glean here. No real sense of whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but Boaz sees it as an opportunity for hospitality. This is the big turning point in Ruth's life as Boaz makes this introduction to her, and he says, "Stay here in my fields. Stay behind my girls. Glean here." He's taking her under his protection because he's telling his workers, leave her alone. Don't mess with her. He then does what Darren does every Friday night. What do you do every Friday night, Darren? What do you do at the farmer's market? A cold drink of water. That's the hospitality that Boaz offers. Here's the water that my men go fetch. You can drink from it. That's above and beyond what any gleaner was supposed to be able to expect. And so Ruth falls down and says, "Why have I found such favor here? Why are you being so kind to me? What is this about?" Maybe it was a rhetorical question. Maybe she's looking for an answer. Either way, Boaz gives her the answer, because I've heard about you. I've heard what you did for Naomi, how you gave up your land, you gave up your family, you gave up your gods, and you came here to a different people, to a different God, in faithful service to Naomi. May God of Israel reward you for that. Well, that's exactly what was happening. The God of Israel was rewarding her through the laws of God for gleaning, through the safety net of Boaz protecting her both from harm of his own workers and harm from anybody else's. From his hospitality of here, have water to drink when you're out working. And then the hospitality continues. At lunchtime, come, have some roasted grain. Have your fill and extra. That's the hand of God at work through the man of Boaz, who is simply being faithful to God. Sometimes we don't realize how the little things can build up to make such a big difference in somebody's life. I didn't know what it meant for Mark to come down from Richmond, for he and I to go to Atlanta. I thought we were just going to have a good time at the conference. It's a little thing. We didn't know what the choice of going off-site to go to Underground for dinner was going to be. It's a little thing. There's my friend Kim from college. It's a little thing. Kim's going to homecoming. It's a little thing. Kim and Tony run into Carolyn. It's a little thing. Carolyn comes back and gives me a call. It's a little thing. Those little things just led to a quarter of a century of my best friend being my wife. God's hand at work. I wonder if you see where God's hand is at work in your life. Maybe right now you're on the Ruth and Naomi side of the equation. You find yourself in a time of bitterness, a time of sorrow, a time of sadness or struggle. God's word is true. God is present and active even then. Maybe you find yourself on Boaz's side of life, living large and having a great day, checking on the field and not having to do the harvest. God's working through you as well. At the conclusion of our story, Ruth comes home to Naomi with 30 pounds of barley plus the roasted grain. And Naomi says, "Oh my, where did you go today? Whose man were you working for? Who's the man you were working for?" It was Boaz. And all of a sudden, Naomi's life starts to see the light at the end of the tunnel. She recognizes it as a God moment because at that point, she's making the connection of, well, he's one of our nearer kinsmen. He's one of our kinsman redeemer. He's one of our Goal. Maybe he could be our safety net through all of this. Because here's the thing, even if Ruth gleaned that hard, working that hard every day, 30 pounds of barley would get two people maybe 5 to 7 days worth of food. There's only 7 weeks of harvest. That leaves her 4 months out of the year to starve. The harvest is over, but God's work is not. As we anticipate next week when we look into the story of Ruth and Boaz for mature audiences only, I invite you to examine where God is working in your life. What are the little things that he's either bringing to you or bringing through you? And how can you celebrate God at work?